And secondly, the chat. And Xander will be here. Good. I wanted to start with, oh, I want to check this too. Yeah, Xander. Oh, okay, well, good. Start with this. One of the things I really want to impress upon you in this class is the ever-changing nature of the subjects of this course, the art, especially up until, well, actually even up until the present, but pre-Renaissance art around the world, we're finding out more stuff almost on a daily basis. And this came around, this is from Smithsonian Magazine, and as you see, the date, October 25th. So this is like old news, like 2 days. Bottom line, it says that they're figuring out that the mummification process is actually actually much older, by a millennium, older than they thought. And so how they got there, was it in this tomb? They analyzed the paintings, the hieroglyphics, if you will. Researchers discovered, Cooey's richly painted tomb in 2019. So it was 2 years ago. And it took them a while to figure this out. And a high-ranking tomb in the Old Kingdom known as Cooey. And so they excavated this. They're finding more tombs all of the time. And when they find the tombs, it adds to the knowledge base. It really keeps building. And another thing that actually caught my eye was this. And this is actually, I think we can actually oops, sorry. I was double checking. Now, I gotta get this playing again. There. Okay, good. So that's what the tomb looked like. And this also caught my eye too. This quote by Salima Ikram. I might have mentioned her before. She is a friend of a friend. She's like the best friend of the person that teaches Egyptology and ancient art at Truman State, with whom I worked with for 20 years. And occasionally Salima would come and visit and do a guest lecture. So that's my brush with greatness. And the other thing is, it says here, and I want to show you this, it says, Ikram and her colleagues are set to share the initial findings in an upcoming episode of National Geographic series Lost Treasures of Egypt. If you have Spectrum cable, you'll probably be able to see this when it comes out. I watch this stuff all of the time. Salima is in some of them. Dr. Hawass, who is the chairperson of antiquities in Egypt, he's on a lot of them. And then there's another guy that used to come to Truman. His name is Aidan Dotson. And he's on these sometimes, but his specialty is actually more about the Aegean and Mediterranean cultures. So if you're doing something on the palace at Knossos, you'll probably see Aidan Dotson. So here I am, wanted to brag about my brush with greatness, and again, talk to you about here we go. About excuse me. Got it going. About how this stuff is changing. The knowledge base, everything changes all of the time. And so I want to kind of go back here and to the modules and show you this. I just found this. I was watching television and I saw a trailer for the upcoming Marvel Comics movie, The Eternals. And so something caught my eye and I decided I should probably look this up. And let me see if I got the right screen share on this. Yeah, we can do this. This is what I found. Comic book movie, Eternals, set photos, tease, Eternal sets. Photo tease a visit to the ancient city of Babylon. And this is the Ishtar Gate, and this is where it is. It's in Berlin at their National Art Museum. And so here it is. This is Eternals new photo teases Babylon timeline. This is actually from.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to Movie First, the channel, which keeps you updated on latest MCU news and movie before your friends and foes. So, guys, the Banners movie is released on Diwali, and it's going to be the biggest movie after ending in whole MCU. अब मूवी की स्टार कास्ट की तरह इसके सेट्स भी काफी शानदार और एपिक बनाए जा रहे हैं। और अभी कुछ हफ्तों पहले ये Banners मूवी सेट फोटोज रिलीज हुई थी जिसमें एंजेलिना जोली को स्पेलिंग मशीन इन वाटर। जी हाँ, इसकी विसर्जन। और अब हाल ही में लेटेस्ट सेट की फोटोज लीक हुई हैं जो कि काफी कुछ बैकग्राउंड से की तरह लग रही हैं।
So anyway, this was kind of what I wanted. Why I like this. This is, I think this video is from India because he goes back and forth between Hindi and English. And in India, the languages are used both very, very much. And so anyway, this is how they're setting the stage. They are building here the Ishtar Gate. So, again, ancient art pops up in modern day culture. Just saying. And I have an eye for that. Now, when I see movies and television programs and other kinds of media, and there are paintings on the walls or sets or anything, I'm like, my radar lights up. So with that being said, let me make sure I got the right screen share here. Work and slideshow from beginning. So now that I got that out of the way and off my chest, and time to take a look at the rest of medieval art and Romanesque art. So here, I think this is kind of about where we left off last time. We took a look at the video about manuscript illumination, and that is the text and the pictures, which is radically different than the calligraphy that we see used in the Islamic world, where they are transcribing, making copies of the Quran, which doesn't have the accompanying pictures of what is being read or written. And so anyway, bottom line, all of these things that we see are basically, how should I say this? I showed you the video on the trailer for Vikings and how all of that was kind of what the culture was about in those what they call dark ages. And as I was telling you, the Vikings could come up river and plunder, pillage the settlements. And so what happens as a result of this is that a lot of the culture, the Western culture as we know it, really survives in the monasteries. And the monasteries themselves are built away from the cities. And so they don't, because they wanted them to be safe. They didn't want the Vikings, the barbarians, to come and pillage and loot destroy their culture, essentially. So in these ages, there were only really a few people who understood language, that could read, that could write, that could do calligraphy and make books. And so all of these manuscript illustrations come from monasteries. They come from monks and sometimes nuns who are putting together books to preserve the culture. And so this is an early one, and bottom line, very simple. And if we talk about the Celtic culture, the weave, what was going on here, that's right out of the Viking tradition. And this is another one too, but this doesn't have the knot pattern. This is called Celtic cross, and you see the knots and the weaving. The bottom line is that in the early manuscript illustrations, we see that. That is Scandinavian Viking influence. And we see some of that going on here. And here as well. And so this is the late 8th, early 19th century. And Ionia, Scotland, which is part of the world that was under Viking rule. And so anyway, but in the monasteries, this idea of Christianity was preserved. And so 698, 721, tempera on vellum. St. Matthew, writing the Gospels according to St. Matthew. And so anyway, you know, we kind of lose a lot of that naturalism. We kind of take the Byzantine approach to making things much more symbolic, that you have to read the iconography. And so anyway, this is commentary on the Apocalypse. And this is from Tabara, Spain, 970. I showed you it's in the other chapter. How we could trace some Asian influence into Islamic art. I showed you that one illustration that looked like it could have been made in Japan. And so that illustration, that kind of art actually does make its way via the Islamic world, but into mainstream Christian culture. And the way this house is set up, the way the ladders are, the kind of perspective we see, the cutaway, that's right out of Japanese art. And what do we see here? This is why we talk so much about the iconography. Once you knew it from the Byzantine era, it will persist. It will enable you to understand the art for hundreds of years hence. And so this is a little different. Christ is not gotten the beard, but he is enthroned. He does have a book. He is making a gesture of peace. And there's the cross on the halo. And so ink gold colors on vellum, that high quality paper made from sheepskin. Again, more about the Gospels. And St. Matthew becomes kind of central in a lot of these illustrations. And so anyway, simply stated, Matthew actually becomes kind of the patron saint of all of these monastics that are doing this kind of calligraphy and illustration. And so for a lot of these, we really don't know exactly who did everything. St. Matthew again. And still from that time, before the year 1000, there's the 9th century. And so anyway, like in the video, like the guy said, these were books and they were prized. They would show that you had status. And the other part of it was that you were literate. You would be in the upper class. We still kind of talk about people that way. The Illuminati or the literati, the people who know things, the people that can read things, that can understand information, literati, Illuminati, it all comes out of that same thing. Of course, in today's world, with all of this digital information at our fingertips, it's kind of taken on another sort of sinister meaning. But that's where it comes from, because back in the day, those monasteries actually were the ruling class as well. And these kings, these medieval kings, basically, when they had children, they'd always have as many children as they possibly could. they would raise one to be a general, a boy, and they would raise a boy to be the king, the heir. We still see traces of this in today's world where we have these monarchies. We know that, for instance, Prince Charles will ascend to the throne when Queen Elizabeth of England dies. That's out of this time. There's a direct lineage, bloodline. And like I said, it would be an heir to the throne. There would be a general, and typically there would be a son that would enter the priesthood, would be something like a cardinal or a bishop, and they would often be associated with the monasteries because that's where a lot of the word brain trust was about all things religious. And so, bless you. Bottom line is that they would actually make some of their women children, their girl children, become nuns, and also they would be assigned to the monasteries. And so that's how life was at this time. And it was kind of, there's a monastery schematic. And so you see, these places were really, really pretty elaborate. And I think what I want you to kind of notice is central in here, the prayer hall, the chapel. But then around the outside perimeter, you know, you'd have some of these things that would actually function as a cafeteria and different kinds of things. And bedrooms, people that were assigned, they had their bedrooms, you know. It was really quite self-contained, self-sufficient. And because they were away from the villages, and the cities, if you will, what they did was that they actually were self-sufficient in a lot of other ways too, that they would grow their own food. They did agriculture, they did livestock. They could get by without aid from the rest of the population. Self-contained, self-sufficient. And so talking about how things persist in today's world, anybody know about any monasteries around town here, right here in St. Louis? Okay, I'll tell you about one. It's on it's on Clayton Road in Ladue. It's a Carmelite monastery, and they are the Sisters of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. It's where the nuns stay, and they are cloistered, which means that they don't leave the compound unless for extremely urgent things. Yes, Jordan. Yes, exactly. See, we got these things, they still persist today, and it's mostly a Catholic thing, but not entirely. I know about the Carmelite monastery because my wife worked there for about 12 years. She was a lay person, and she was kind of their connection to the outside world. So they still had to pay electric bills, and they actually made rosaries and things, and did some of this kind of stuff too. They would make prayer cards. They would do things by hand. These are handmade images. And because, how should I say this? They had the iconography already there. They had to have the skill to be able to put these things together, but they would make rosaries and other things associated with Catholic faith, and they would sell them. They had a gift shop. My wife ran a gift shop, and so on. Bottom line is that there are traces of this still today. And so Utrecht Psalter. Psalter means prayer book. And so, again, and you see this is kind of an interesting, this is in some ways kind of an outlier, because this drawing is like really quite interesting. It's interesting partly because it's not a painting. We don't see it developed in full color. But the way that it's drawn looks like it could have been done 500 years later or even today. This is kind of how drawing operates. And if you're really into art, you know that drawing has its own conventions. This is really quite good. And so more manuscript illustrations, bottom line, elaborate, and this is in the 11th century. So they kind of evolve. And this is the front cover of the Lindau Gospels. And so anyway, take a look at this. When you take a look at manuscript illuminations and the other depictions of Christ in the painting that we see, this actually looks like the kind of Bible that Christ would be holding, adorned with jewels and semi-precious stones, gold, leaf, etc., and obviously the cross. And so it evolves and it persists. And why are there so many of these in the book? Partly because the book is an encyclopedia. And this encyclopedia is like kind of full of the stuff that we know about. And from this era, from this place, this is where most of the art was created, in the monasteries and as manuscript illumination. And so I'm trying to think. What is, anybody know this? I'm at a loss for a word. There's agape, is that it? Washing of the feet. Right. And again, sometimes they go off script and Christ doesn't have a beard, but he has enough of the other iconography that we know who he is. And this is something that kind of starts to creep into this. And this is from roughly the turn of the millennia. And this is one of the monarchs of the Holy Roman Empire. That's another thing that kind of feeds all of this stuff. We don't really have organized countries in Central Europe. And what happens is that the Pope kind of in Rome actually kind of assumes authority. And nobody gets to be king unless approved by the papacy. And so you got Charlemagne as the first emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. That's in the 9th century. And then we get a lot of emperors from the Holy Roman Empire, and they're basically Franks or Germans. It's basically Central Europe. And that that authority of the papacy persists for a long, long time. Now, the Pope doesn't really have as much say in political issues and in terms of power and authority, at least in the secular world. But back then, you didn't become king unless you had your allegiance to the Pope and to the Catholic Church. And this persists all the way up until, well, it persists for centuries. And I can say that Henry VIII is a good example of this. He had married, well, he had 6 wives, King Henry VIII of England, and he wanted to divorce one of them, and the Pope said, you can't divorce. So Henry VIII starts another church. It's called the Church of England. And but that was kind of the way things worked. You wanted to do something, you had to ask permission from the Pope. The Pope basically gave permission to these kings, or actually ordered some of these kings to go into the Middle East and reclaim the Holy Land for Christianity. Those were the Crusades. We also had an agreement in the early 16th century when Spain and Portugal were colonizing South America, and they were fighting over it. And the Pope said, well, this is good. You Portuguese, you Spaniards are spreading Christianity. So let's not fight amongst ourselves. Let's draw a line right down the middle of South America, and everything to the east is Portuguese, everything to the west is Spanish. And even to this day, Brazilians speak Portuguese. Anyway, that's how the world worked. And so the Holy Roman Empire is really the government for a long time. Sculpture, don't have a lot of sculpture. And we don't even know if this is Charlemagne or Charles the Bald, one of the successors. But bottom line, this is what they did. They kind of still knew how to cast bronze. It's not quite as, how should I say, naturalistic in proportion as to some of the bronze equestrian sculptures that we see out of the Roman Empire, Marcus Aurelius on horseback and stuff like that. But at any rate, that continues. And again, I told you about these Celtic crosses and showing the influence, the legacy of the Nordic invasions. And again, these things persist. This is a little later. This is 8th century. This is 10th century. And so anyway, we got, they use some of the same visual strategies, conventions, if you will. And they put inside this Celtic cross these friezes, these registers that tell a story. We've seen that all the way back to ancient Babylon. And so architecture, this is kind of an interesting thing too. And I'm glad that it's at the end here, because when we look at Romanesque, we'll see this really develop. But bottom line is that during these years, 7th, 8th, 9th centuries, they still built places of worship, churches, if you will. But bottom line is there nothing in comparison to what's going on in the Islamic world. We've seen all of these magnificent mosques being built throughout the Islamic world, the mausoleums, the architecture, the art, the mosaic. And here, it kind of simplistic, kind of elementary by comparison. And so this is where they start off. Like I say, a lot of the learning and knowledge developed during Roman times really doesn't exist here anymore. It does in the East, but not here in Christian Spain and in Central Europe and England for that matter. And so the Chapel of Charlemagne, Palatine Chapel. So here, yeah, this is where they really start to pull it together. And this, again, magnificent. Do you see any legacy here? Archways, Roman columns, all the way into antiquity. How about the striped archways? That's right out of mosque, right out of Islam. That is, so they're borrowing pretty heavily from the other cultures to kind of rebuild their own. And so the architecture starts in short order to kind of get more elaborate. I want to kind of point out something here too. This is an aside, but I think it's important. You see here, it's not pews, they're chairs, movable chairs, temporary chairs, not fixed to the ground. Just like the mosque we've seen, just like the early cathedrals we've seen, no benches, no pews. It's open. An elaborate chandelier hanging all the way from the dome ceiling. And we'll kind of take a look at some of this here too, because I think this owes a lot more to the mosque than you would think at first glance. And so look at this kind of patterning. It's not as richly decorated or adorned as the mosque would be, but we see some of that. We see some of that up in here. It's something we would not see in a mosque, and that these figures on the wall. But look at the stained glass. That's right out of the Islamic world too. As I said, the striped archways. And the idea of putting language, words, scriptures, written messages as part of the adornment. We see that all over in Islamic art, and we're seeing that here still too. So it really kind of owes a lot to what's going on in the rest of the world. And here's an outside view. And you can see it's pretty sophisticated. Now you take a look at the brickwork, the stonework doesn't have all of these rich patterns. It doesn't have all of these mosaics and all of the intricacy of an Islamic mosque. But again, it still has some of the architectural features and some degree of ornamentation. That will change as we move along. This is called the Tour Hall. And this is like City Hall. It's like a gathering place. And you can see some of that, the pattern is starting to come back. Not quite what we see around the rest of the world, but again, here we go. Abbey of St. Ricoeur. Excuse me. This would be one of those places, monastery, an abbey. buildings where the monks reside. And the other part of it is you can see this. It's walled off. Maybe it's to keep people in, but probably more it's about protection and fortification. Again, they had enemies, and they had to protect themselves. So you see something going on here. Starting to see the beginnings of what will eventually be Gothic cathedrals, spires, bell towers, and again, this is the Abbey Church, and this is the Church of. Anyway, and we see what's happening here. This is a carryover from those places like San Vitale in Ravenna, where they would have this cylindrical apse at the end where the mass would be conducted. And we would call that an apsidial temple. And here's what it looks like from the inside. Again, long hallway, mass conducted here, archways, and more adornment. We're starting to see that come back. So by the turn of the century, we're getting much, much more developed. And part of this has to do with, by really about 1000 or so, we don't see the invaders attacking so much, and probably in part because of people like Charlemagne who organized armies and made it kind of dangerous for invaders to come and rob and pillage their country, their cities, their towns. So anyway, this is, they're coming out, they're rising out of the darkness of the Dark Ages. And so we see these in Germany. Germany is a little bit more protected, but again, we still see the traces of Islamic architecture. And why? Because places like Baghdad, they were like the MIT, the Silicon Valley. They were where knowledge was, and you wanted architects, you wanted to know how to build something. You went there, and so doors. This is something that happens on cathedrals and baptistries and other Christian buildings, is that they start to adorn the doors with scenes from the Bible in low relief. And so this is, and they were cast bronze. These doors were very heavy, kind of did two things too. It was protection. You couldn't really get through these doors, probably not even with the battering ram, big and heavy and strong. But the other part of it is most of the folks attending religious services were illiterate. So they couldn't read. They had to make sense of what was being told to them through the gospel readings, the epistle, what they were learning from the church. And so anyway, you can pick out a number of these. Pretty easy to figure. Obviously, the crucifixion, flagellation, trial of Christ. So this is basically looks like the, and there's, yeah, never mind, I'm talking about this. Anyway, bottom line, religious scenes. And where we've seen this before, ancient Babylon, where we see the friezes, and we see this in Rome too, Hadrian's column, for example. We see columns with this spiral relief, this register that follow it around and tells the story. All of these things. This is how, you know, when I talk to you guys about legacy in presentations, this is legacy. It's how the artwork or the inventions of the artist or the iconography or even the medium survive. They're taken up by new generations, maybe sometimes different countries, different belief systems, different millennia. And so, yeah, here's one of those door panels that I was talking about. And God accusing Adam and Eve of eating from the tree of knowledge, the fruit. Look at Adam. She did it. That's something you'll find in a lot of this Christian iconography. This will last really through the 19th, early 20th century. Is that this whole episode from the book of Genesis, where they defied God and ate from the tree of knowledge, the forbidden fruit, it's always blamed on Eve. And there are all kinds of other artworks through the centuries that blame her. And here's another thing that's kind of interesting too, because they actually practice modesty. We don't see nudes so much anymore. We haven't seen that for a long time. There was, we're not in ancient Greece or Rome. They glorified nudity in the human body. After the Byzantine era, it didn't happen. You don't see nudes. But in this case, it's part of the story. Part of the story that Adam and Eve were not clothed and they were not ashamed of their nakedness. And so you see, they're both holding fig leaves over their genitals. And then you see this tiny little thing right there. That goes as a signifier for the female. To say. And so here's the serpent, the devil that tempted them, and so on. But Adam trying to blame it on somebody else. Well, it's kind of a typical guy. And so we got ivory persists. Ivory carving, as we talked about, was really done a lot in this era. And we saw some Islamic art for export. We saw the container carved out of ivory. So anyway, this is like a really good example of what aged ivory looks like, because it's actually part of a living thing. It deteriorates over time. So you see the aging, but you can also see the delicate carving and so on. And basically, Otto I, Holy Roman Emperor, presenting Magdeburg Cathedral to Christ. And so that always becomes the motivation for building these cathedrals, is that they're not building them for the Pope, they're not building them for the emperor. It's something that our leaders, the popes, the emperors, were doing to get to God. And so that's how they looked at it, and that's basic. You'll see that a lot too. We saw that in Justinian's time. Justinian presenting San Vitale to Christ. And Otto II and Theophanu, blessed by Christ. Anyway, this is that Holy Roman Empire. The authority comes through the Pope, through the emperors, and so on. And so another late medieval church. Again, some of the same things I keep telling you. Here's something that's represents, at least to my mind, and I think to a lot of scholars, that's something I came up with independently. The idea of depicting the crucifixion had always been kind of a touchy thing in Christianity, because did you want to depict Christ, in this case, as dying and dead, when we know as Christians that, or at least as a lot of Christians believe, that you can't kill God. He'd never die. We know he died on the cross, but we would never portray that because he was never really dead. And so you see a lot of these Byzantine and medieval portrayals of Christ, and he'll be on the cross, and he'll still be strong and still be with his eyes wide open, and in some cases staring back at you to make sure that you're good. And in this case, this is like a sea change in the theology. This is a Christ hanging from the cross. We still see the halo with the cross, and we also introduce this into the crucifix. We call it a crucifix now because it's when Christ was crucified, but INRI, which is Latin for Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, Rex R. King, and I was the J. And so anyway, that kind of accounts for the Middle Ages. And then there's as I was saying earlier, how the knowledge base actually increases all of the time, almost exponentially. Archaeologists in Norway find rare Viking burial using only radar, using ground penetrating radar technology. This is it. This is both. Here are the findings. Here's something else I want to really kind of point out. We talked in here about primary sources and reliable sources. And oftentimes, like in the piece about mummification I just showed you, published Tuesday in the Antiquity Journal. That's the name of the journal, Antiquity. And And so that is a peer-reviewed source. And so when you get information from places like BBC, Smithsonian, National Geographic, CNN, NBC, they almost always tell you what journal you can find that information in, because their journalistic ethics demand that they verify what they present. They have to have confirmation. They gotta reveal their sources when they can. So anyway, just saying. And that is that. And slideshow from beginning. Make sure I got the right share. That's good. Romanesque. And this is kind of a similar, this is a timeline between what we call medieval and what we call Gothic. It's a kind of a shorter period. And one of its characteristics is that it does change, it does trace everything back to Rome. And so here is Western Europe, 1100 Common Era. And so we got the Kingdom of Leon and Castile and the Umayyad Caliphate. And you see the places like Cordoba and Seville where there are libraries and mosques and things. This is still part of the Islamic world. And we start to see these kingdoms actually develop. Kingdom of France, that breaks off from the Holy Roman Empire. We see the Norman Kingdom, basically England. And this is kind of an interesting thing here. I never quite understood why this is, but bottom line is that these people, the Normans from Normandy in northern France, they kind of settle here. They're from here. They kind of mix in and settle England and Sicily and southern Italian peninsula. But this is what I was talking about. After a while, we see we're not even showing Scandinavia on this map anymore. Sweden, Norway, the Viking culture is in kind of decline. They're not out there robbing people. They're not coming down, say, the Rhine River and pillaging all of these places. Some of the other rivers that you see that flow into the English Channel, the North Sea, the Baltic Sea, they're not happening. But this organizes as the Holy Roman Empire. So I want to kind of point out something. The Holy Roman Empire kind of stays intact until the 19th century. This area is kind of jointly ruled by the Catholic Church and by whatever monarchs happen to be in power. And so this has a profound effect in the years after 1500. This is only 1100. But basically, it stays the same, except that Spain and Portugal are no longer part of the Islamic world. But basically, this stays the same. And what happens in the Holy Roman Empire is that, like I said, it stays intact until the mid-19th century. It's like 1863 or something. And what profound effect might that be? Well, while these places like Spain, Portugal, France, England, or sailing around the world and colonizing anything that they could find. This part stayed basically provincial. They didn't go out, they didn't have colonies. And by the 19th century, economics demanded that if you wanted to be a European country with wealth and power, that you really needed to have colonies that you could rob, that you could mine for their natural resources, that you could claim as your own to, in a lot of cases, enslave the indigenous populations, so on. So that is the era from 1500 to 1900, the era of European colonization all around the world. For bad or for good, that's what happened. These guys here, this is modern day Germany, this is modern day Italy. They weren't on that track. So in the 20th century, we find out why it is that these guys become belligerents in both of the wars. They don't have any colonies. They want to keep up. They want to be rich like England, rich like France, rich like Spain. No colonies. Just go to war, take them back. A simplistic view, but it has a lot to do with how they saw things and what happened in history. And so, Gisselbertus, Last Judgment. And this is from the West Campanium, which is the place where there's an entryway. And we see it's the 12th century. And again, we're starting to see a lot more decoration. St. Louis delivering the crown of thorns. Again, I was talking about St. Louis being a primary figure in medieval times because he was a crusader and blessed by the Pope and determined to be a saint after his death. Anyway, this is something, a reliquary. What is a reliquary? Excuse me. Reliquary. It's kind of like a relic. That's where the root word comes from. And what this is a place where relics from Saint Faith, Saint Foy, are stored. And so this is part of the Crusader legacy. I want to show you this. St. Louis delivering the crown of thorns. That was not, like the real crown of thorns, but that's what the Crusaders did. That was one of their primary motivations. They wanted to reclaim Jerusalem for Christianity, and he wanted the relics. And so when St. Helena was sent to Jerusalem and Damascus and these places, when Constantine was in power in the 4th century, she brought back a lot of relics. And supposedly splinters from the true cross, other kinds of artifacts associated with Christianity. And during the Crusades, we see a revival of that. And that's part of what the Crusaders, even though they weren't very successful at occupying and maintaining a presence in the Middle East, they would bring back a whole lot of stuff. And so those are relics. And the church also venerates relics, maybe not so much from the time of Christ, but all of the significant Christian figures afterwards. And so we have, by this time, here we are in the 10th century, we have a whole lot of saints. And so anything that brings us closer to these saints becomes a relic. And in these reliquaries, and they made a lot of these, one for each saint, if they had something like a bone, a finger, something, maybe the entire skeleton, whatever, they would end up here. They would be the relics of this holy person. Again, it stems out of St. Helena in Constantine times through the Crusades, and this is how they practice Christianity. They have relics. And in Catholic churches, there are officially supposed to be some kind of relic of whatever saint the church is named after. So if you have St. Anthony's Church on Merrimack Street, somewhere in that altar is a relic from St. Anthony, St. Francis, whoever. And so this is something that's kind of very different. It's very different from what most religions practice this way. And so the cathedrals start to become higher. Their technology is growing. The architectural skills are growing. Again, I want to point out folding chairs wasn't originally intended to be seated. Folding chairs. That's St. Vincent, St. Gilbert. St. Cernan. Let's say just a little bit about this before we go. This is like proto-Gothic cathedral. This is what we're going from. Those simple churches that we see in Spain and France and Germany, they become more elaborate over the centuries. And by this time, we're building huge edifices. And I want you to see this. This becomes kind of a model for what Gothic architecture will become. Can you see the shape of this building? It's a cross. So the architecture, the buildings, unlike other buildings, this is coming into its own. It's not as reliant on other periods and other people and other faiths for their architectural design. They are developing something that is more uniquely Christian. And I think that probably that can be best seen from the shape. There's some other things that will persist, but we'll talk about that next week. It's late. I almost forgot. I put on assignments. I got 3 minutes to show you this. Assignments. Here we go. Quiz 4. And so what I want you to do is write a 3-paragraph paper on why you chose the artwork that you're going to do your presentation on. I know some of you haven't decided. If you haven't decided, you can actually pick one, write about it, what you like about it. This essay is about your personal feelings about the work and your opinion of the work. Here are the groups we have in this class. These are the pairings. These are the ones that I know about, what you guys have chosen. Parthenon, Anastasis, Great Sphinx. If you guys agree on what you're writing, you can both write on the same thing. If you don't agree, that's okay. You can write about something you like, and that might help you and your partner decide which one of you are choosing the artwork you will research. And so it's kind of a way to jumpstart. And so it's not due for a while. Wednesday the 3rd. Thank you. So anyway, this is up and it's available right now from noon. It's been available for 14 minutes. So I hit this. I forgot I did. Sorry, I didn't explain this more. I got all caught up in cathedrals and stuff, and relics, and so on. But two or three paragraph essay and use the right terminology, and it is your personal opinion of the work. I'm hoping that this will be a foundation. It'll be something that will reappear in your narrated PowerPoint presentations. If not entirely the whole thing, at least parts of it. It gets you a jump start, kind of hoping it will encourage you guys in the groups to choose a subject. And again, like I said, you got a week. Think about it. Any questions now? Question is, what time is it? 12:15. Means I gotta let you go. So have a good weekend.